Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, holding the railing with his aged hands as the massive fleet moved steadily through the Pacific Ocean, heading toward Midway. The morning sun cast long shadows on the flight deck, where crew members carried out final checks on Zero fighters and Kate torpedo planes. In Nagumo's view, this mission was the natural next move in Japan's plan to dominate the Pacific, a powerful strike that would push America to agree to peace talks. The strategy looked perfect in its details. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, had created Operation Me as a brilliant move in naval warfare. Akagi Kaga and Soryu would attack Midway's defenses, while a large invasion force would take the island. Yamamoto believed the Americans would rush to defend Midway with their remaining carriers, falling right into Japan's stronger naval group. Nagumo looked over the latest intelligence with confidence. The U.S. Navy had been badly weakened at Pearl Harbor just 7 months ago. At most, they could field 2 or 3 carriers, while Japan had 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, and powerful warships and support. The odds seemed clearly in Japan's favor. Captain Minoru Genda Nagumo's air operations expert and one of Japan's smartest strategists came forward with the final plans. Their pilots had trained thoroughly, mastering dive bombing and torpedo techniques. The carrier crews worked with near-perfect skill, thanks to months of combat experience across the Pacific from the Coral Sea to the Indian Ocean. Japan's naval air power had shown its strength over and over, but despite all the confidence, there were quiet hints of trouble that few wanted to talk about. Some intercepted American radio signals hinted at strange movements. Even though intelligence staff dismissed them as routine, Japan's submarines hadn't spotted any major U.S. ships. But this wasn't seen as alarming due to the ocean's vast size with many places to hide. This account is based on declassified Japanese Navy records and post-war interviews. As Akagi's engines hummed toward their goal, Nagumo felt pressure from Tokyo. Even Emperor Hirohito had approved the plan, seeing Midway as the key to securing Japan's hold in the Pacific. Nagumo's earlier victories at Pearl Harbor and in the Indian Ocean had given him the image of an unstoppable naval leader. The weather was ideal, with clear skies expected for the dawn strike. The 4 carriers stayed perfectly in formation, surrounded by destroyers and cruisers in defensive positions. Below deck, pilots listened to their final instructions, studying photos of Midway's layout and defenses. Intelligence believed U.S. resistance would be weak, maybe a few scout planes and shore guns. The island was said to be defended by Marines. With little air or naval support, Japanese commanders expected to finish the attack and invasion in 2 days, setting up a base that could even threaten Hawaii. Late at night on June 3rd, Nagumo went to his quarters, fully confident in victory. His fleet had reached Midway unnoticed. His last note in his private log showed complete certainty. The enemy would not have enough power to stop Japan's might. Meanwhile, in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, Commander Joseph Rochefort leaned over his desk, surrounded by piles of decoded Japanese messages. His code-breaking team had worked non-stop for weeks, pulling together pieces of Japanese communications that revealed something stunning: Japan's full battle plan for Midway. This breakthrough came after long study of Japanese naval codes, especially the JN-25 cipher. Rochefort's team figured out that AF was the target, but they had to confirm that AF meant Midway. To do this, they tricked Japan by sending a message from Midway saying they were short on water, then intercepted Japanese reports talking about water problems at AF. The trap had worked. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, reviewed the intelligence with growing interest. Japan was planning its biggest move since Pearl Harbor, sending all its main carriers to take Midway. Even more helpful, the codebreakers gave Nimitz detailed knowledge about the enemy's ships, timing, and travel paths. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, gave a briefing. Nagumo's 4 carriers would come from the northwest, while Yamamoto's group would follow with battleships. At the same time, another Japanese force would attack from the southwest. This showed how Japan was spreading out its forces. This intelligence victory was the result of years of hard cryptography work. Building on pre-war efforts to crack Japanese codes, Rochefort's team had learned to recognize key officers, ship call signs, and tactics from careful study of radio traffic. They could now read Japanese messages nearly as fast as the Japanese could. These insights are backed by NSA studies and Rochefort's later testimony. Nimitz now had a major decision to make, one with high stakes. The U.S. still had limited strength after Pearl Harbor. Only 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the just-drapered Yorktown, were available to face Japan's 4 fleet carriers and their escorts. But now, the U.S. had an edge. Information, knowing what Japan planned and where they would come from, allowed Nimitz to set up his own forces in a way that could catch them off guard. The Americans could strike first while the Japanese were distracted. By launching or recovering planes, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, leading Task Force 17 aboard Yorktown, got sealed orders describing the intelligence findings. Yorktown had just undergone quick repairs after the Coral Sea battle, with workers fixing it in record time. Her presence would help balance the fight in the air. Vice Admiral William Halsey, known for aggressive tactics, was sick and couldn't join. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance stepped in. He was more careful and focused, which would suit the complicated battle ahead. As June 4th drew near, U.S. preparations grew across the Pacific. Midway's Marine forces were reinforced and got more planes, turning the island into a forward airbase. Flying fortresses flew in from Hawaii for long-range patrols and bombings. The codebreakers' work had exposed not just Japanese plans but a big flaw. Yamamoto's strategy scattered his forces over a wide area, making them unable to support each other in time. Us planners saw this as a chance to take on Japan's units one by one if they could keep the element of surprise. At dawn, Nagumo's carrier group cut smoothly through the water, 150 miles from Midway. Flight crews on deck moved swiftly, lining up planes for the first attack. Zero fighters warmed up their engines, while Kate bombers were armed with explosive and fire-starting bombs. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, should have led this one too, but was recovering from surgery. His place was taken by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, who now received the final instructions. The first strike would include 36 Kate bombers, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zeros, a powerful wave expected to destroy Midway's defenses. On the carrier, Soryu, Lieutenant Commander Takimori gave orders to his dive bombers. Based on scouting, the American base didn't look heavily guarded, and little fighter resistance was expected. The crews expected a simple mission, much like earlier successful raids across the Pacific. At 0430, Tominaga's planes began launching from all four carriers. The takeoff was smooth, showing how well-trained Japan's naval air forces were. In no time, all 108 planes were in the air, flying in tight formation toward Midway. Nagumo watched with pride, sure that victory was near. He kept 93 planes in reserve on his carriers, ready to launch if U.S. ships appeared. Though they didn't expect enemy carriers, standard procedure called for being ready. These backup planes were armed with bombs and torpedoes designed to take down warships. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu reported that all systems were ready. His pilots had recently shown high skill during training, mastering attacks that had crushed Allied ships throughout the Pacific. Japan's carrier-based aviation was at its peak. This section is based on official Japanese combat reports and pilot interviews gathered by Allied investigators. Still, there were quiet signs the U.S. might offer more resistance than expected. Intercepted radio messages from Midway were increasing, though intelligence teams brushed them off as normal defense steps. Some patrol planes had spotted unknown ships to the northeast, but these were assumed to be regular merchant vessels and ignored. Nagumo's team checked the weather and timing again. The skies were clear, perfect for a bombing run, and the sea was calm, making it easy to recover aircraft. Everything looked ideal for catching the Americans by surprise. The carriers kept radio silence as they neared Midway. Destroyers guarded the sides from submarines, while cruisers were ready with anti-aircraft guns. The whole group moved with the precision gained from months of wartime missions. As Tominaga's aircraft disappeared into the distance, the crews below prepared more planes for a second wave. Weapons teams waited to adjust bomb loads based on how much damage the first attack caused. The Japanese war machine ran smoothly, shaped by experience. Pilots not on the first strike stayed below, listening to updates. Most expected an easy win with little U.S. resistance, thinking Midway would be another step in Japan's unstoppable advance. Their confidence had only grown after 6 months of victory. Navigation teams planned for pulling back after the attack, calculating fuel and timing. The goal was to finish bombing by 8 a.m., allowing time to recover planes and move again before any American response. Everything seemed covered in Yamamoto's carefully designed plan. But suddenly, Catalina flying boat pilot Lieutenant Howard 80 spotted the Japanese fleet through his binoculars. He quickly radioed in enemy carriers, direction 320, 150 miles from Midway. His message crackled across the airwaves. American forces across the Pacific listened closely to radio frequencies, confirming their intelligence had been correct. On Midway Island, Marine Fighter Squadron 121 rushed to intercept the oncoming Japanese planes using old Brewster Buffalo fighters. Major Floyd Parks led 25 outdated planes to face Tominaga's modern air group. He knew his men were badly outmatched, but they were determined to defend Midway. The Marines climbed quickly, heading straight toward the incoming enemy planes. Aboard the carrier Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance received word of the enemy contact at 6:34 a.m. The Japanese carriers were exactly where they had been predicted to be, coming from the northwest in a tight group. Spruance immediately turned his fleet toward them and got ready to launch a full attack while Nagumo's planes were busy hitting Midway. Tomonaga's bombers reached Midway at 6:35 a.m. and were met with more resistance than expected. Marine pilots and anti-aircraft guns fought back hard. Even though the Buffalo fighters were no match for the Japanese Zeros, they launched brave attacks that broke up enemy formations. Ground defenses filled the air with deadly fire. Even with the tough defense, the Japanese bombers still caused serious damage. Fuel tanks exploded into fireballs, and hangars and barracks took direct hits. But the runway still worked, and many important areas were not destroyed. These facts come from Marine records and Japanese pilot reports. Major Parks and his pilots faced impossible odds, flying old planes with weak weapons, and suffered heavy losses. To 15 of the 25 fighters were shot down in minutes, but their sacrifice broke up the enemy's attack enough to save key parts of the base. Tomonaga evaluated the bombing and sent an urgent message to Nagumo, saying a second strike would be needed to finish the job. This message would greatly influence the battle because it convinced Nagumo to prepare his reserve aircraft for another strike on Midway instead of keeping them armed for fighting ships. On Akagi, Nagumo now faced his first major choice. Tomonaga's request clashed with previous orders that told him to keep reserve planes ready to attack enemy ships. Intelligence suggested the U.S. had few or no carriers nearby, but good naval practice demanded readiness for anything. Nagumo decided to switch the reserve planes to land attack mode, ordering crews to replace armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes with explosives for ground targets. This would take time and leave the carriers unable to respond quickly if U.S. ships showed up. As Japanese crews worked to rearm their planes, American intelligence teams intercepted their radio messages and discovered Nagumo's plan. The Japanese were going to strike Midway again, which opened the perfect moment for a U.S. counterattack. Spruance's force moved fast to get into striking distance. His pilots knew this mission could decide who controlled the Pacific. The trap they had set was now beginning to snap shut around the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey got his final briefing in Enterprise's ready room. He carefully studied target photos and attack plans. As the dive bomber squadron leader, he would lead 37 Dauntless planes against the Japanese carriers. The enemy was about 200 miles to the southwest, one of the most important targets of the entire war. At 7 a.m., the Enterprise Air Group launched in order. First came the torpedo planes under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, then dive bombers, and finally, Wildcat fighters from the fighter squadron. The whole launch was carried out smoothly, despite the pressure. At the same time, Hornet launched its air group, led by Strike Commander Stanhope Ring. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron, 8 with 15 outdated Devastator planes toward their critical mission. These slow aircraft would have little protection against fast Japanese Zeros. Still, the crews understood how important this moment was. Rear Admiral Fletcher aboard Yorktown held off on launching his planes right away, wanting to stay flexible. His air group was ready and waiting. Fletcher's caution came from past experiences where acting too early had led to disaster. The U.S. attack groups left their carriers knowing they were outgunned and facing Japan's best pilots flying superior planes. The Zeros had dominated every air battle since Pearl Harbor. American pilots knew their equipment was older, but they also knew the mission had to succeed. Waldron, trusting his instincts, decided not to follow the planned route and led his squadron straight toward the enemy. This choice would turn out to be both tragic and important. His 15 torpedo planes flew without fighter support and had little chance of survival. These details are backed by Navy reports and pilot interviews stored. At the Naval Historical Center, at 9:30 a.m., Japanese fighters spotted the incoming U.S. planes. Led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, the Zeros moved to intercept the Devastators. They were slow and outdated, and the Zeros had spent months perfecting ways to shoot them. Don Waldron's squadron charged ahead with great bravery. Even though the odds were hopeless, Zeros attacked from all sides, and anti-aircraft fire from Japanese ships added to the danger. One by one, the Devastators were shot down. Only Ensign George Gay survived from the entire squadron. His plane crashed, but he stayed alive in the ocean, where he watched the rest of the battle unfold. From the water, he saw Japanese carriers dodging U.S. attacks while preparing their own. The American torpedo planes' sacrifice created a surprising chance. Since the Japanese fighters had gone low to stop the torpedo planes, they left the skies above unguarded. McCluskey's dive bombers now approached from high up without meeting much resistance. On Akagi, Nagumo watched the failed torpedo attacks. With satisfaction, his Zeros had done well, and he believed the danger was over. He thought his carriers were safe, but while he focused on the torpedo attack, the dive bombers were getting into perfect position to strike. The loss of Waldron's squadron had opened the way for a powerful counterattack that would change the war. Nagumo stood on Akagi's bridge, satisfied as he saw the American torpedo planes being wiped out. The Zeros had shot them down easily. showing once again the strength of Japan's naval air force. He believed American planes were no longer a threat. On the flight deck, crews hurried to get the second wave ready to hit Midway again. They swapped out bombs designed for ships and loaded ones better for land targets. This complex task used up valuable time and left the carriers exposed. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukita, though recovering from illness, insisted on staying aboard to watch the battle. From Akagi's control tower, he saw Zeros chasing the last American planes. Everything looked under control. Captain Taijiro Aoki got reports saying the American attacks had done almost no damage. Akagi's crew had kept the formation tight, and air defenses had done their job. The carrier was still fully able to fight. Then, at 9:20 a.m., spotters on the cruiser Chikuma reported more planes coming from the northeast. At first, they seemed like more U.S. torpedo planes trying again. Radar tracked them but did not see their real height or threat level. McCluskey led his dive bombers directly over the Japanese carriers from 14,000 feet. From his cockpit, he saw 4 enemy carriers lined up perfectly. Their decks were full of planes being readied for launch. It was the perfect opportunity. This version is based on pilot interviews and Japanese survivor reports gathered by Allied investigators. The dive bombers had caught the Japanese off guard thanks to good timing and mistakes by the enemy. Since Japanese fighters were busy down low, McCluskey's planes had a huge advantage from above. The Japanese ships were fully exposed. McCluskey picked Akagi as his target and led 17 dive bombers down toward it. The flight deck was crowded with planes, fuel, and ammo ideal for a deadly attack. Lieutenant Dick Best and his section of 3 planes peeled off to strike Kaga instead, realizing it was better to spread the attack across more than one ship. This decision would greatly increase the impact of the raid. At 9:26 a.m., First realized the danger when lookouts reported bombers overhead. He gave the order for emergency moves and maximum defensive fire, but it was too late. The dive bombers had surprise on their side, and the Japanese carriers were at their weakest point. The first American bombs hit Akagi's flight deck at 9:26, triggering massive explosions among the fuel and armed planes. Fires spread quickly, turning the flagship into a blazing ruin. At the same time, Kaga and Soryu were also hit badly. The well-organized Japanese plan was falling apart in just minutes, as 3 carriers were nearly destroyed. While Japanese leaders still didn't grasp how bad things were, Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto felt the impact on Soryu, as bombs tore into her deck and set off more explosions. Fires swept through the ship, burning everything in their path. In minutes, the carrier became a floating inferno. Lieutenant Commander Takashi, one of Japan's top dive bomber pilots, was trapped below as the flames spread. He had once shown great skill at Pearl Harbor, but now those same tactics were being used against him. He tried to escape through smoke-filled hallways. Damage control teams worked to stop the fires, but more explosions kept tearing the ship apart. Torpedo warheads exploded in sequence, blasting holes in the hull. Fires burned at over 1,000 degrees, and the ship's insides began to fall apart. On Soryu's bridge, officers tried to plot escape routes, while engine crews kept the power running. Even as the ship was dying, the crew showed the discipline and professionalism that had made Japan's Navy so feared. Admiral Yamaguchi on the cruiser Tone saw 3 of his carriers burning. He knew the battle had turned against Japan. The American attack had been timed perfectly and struck when the carriers were most helpless. Haryu was the only carrier left, untouched. Her crew was getting ready to strike back right away. Lieutenant Commander Michio Kobayashi was told to lead a full-force attack against the U.S. carriers. Japan's only chance was to destroy the American fleet before it could strike again. These damage reports are based on Japanese naval engineering, records, and survivor statements. Captain Yanagimoto refused to leave Soryu, choosing to go down with his ship. His choice reflected the deep tradition among Japanese naval officers to die with their command. His last radio message gave a clear report on the ship's condition, below the decks. Experienced sailors took charge of emergency repairs, even though the situation seemed hopeless. Water poured into compartments as fires spread, and the ship's structure was damaged badly, making it hard to stay afloat. Japanese engineers kept Soryu going longer, but the damage caused by the precise American bombing was too much to fix. From above, American dive bombers saw flames on their targets, showing that they had successfully hit 3 enemy carriers. But they also spotted a 4th carrier sending out planes right away for a counterattack. This showed the fight was far from over. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, knowing they had struck a major blow, still led the remaining dive bombers back to their ships. He and his men knew a fast and powerful strike would soon come from the undamaged Haryu. Even with their success, the American ships were still in danger. The fight had now turned strongly in America's favor. Still, the Japanese fleet had the power to fight back hard. Admiral Yamamoto's detailed battle plan was starting to fall apart, but parts of the Japanese force still had enough strength to hurt the Americans. Even after the heavy losses, the outcome was not yet certain. Radio messages between Japanese ships showed they were beginning to realize just how bad things were going. Officers were confused and surprised at how the Americans had pulled off such a devastating surprise. Some blamed it on bad luck, ignoring the real cause: America's superior planning and codebreaking. Because Japan didn't understand how well the Americans had broken their codes, they kept making poor choices in battle. Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi stood on Hiryu's command deck. His ship was the only carrier left undamaged in a fleet that had ruled the Pacific for half a year. Around him, the burnt-out remains of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu showed how effective the American attack had been. But Yamaguchi wouldn't give up. The planes still in Hiryu were Japan's last hope to turn the battle around. Lieutenant Commander Michio Kobayashi quickly got his squadron ready to launch against the American ships. Reports said the enemy fleet was to the northeast, within reach of Hiryu's experienced pilots. These airmen were the best of Japan's navy, having survived Pearl Harbor and many earlier victories. The first strike team was made up of 18 dive bombers and 6 fighter planes. They took off at 10:30 a.m., led by Kobayashi, and carried the hopes of the entire Japanese fleet. Their mission was to destroy the American carriers before they could launch another attack. Captain Tomio Kaku oversaw the launch carefully. Even in the middle of the emergency, Hiryu's deck crew worked like experts. Their skill was part of what made Japan's carrier force so dangerous. Admiral Yamaguchi knew this counterattack was Japan's last chance. The American carriers had done massive damage thanks to smart planning and perfect timing, but they were still open to a strong counterstrike. Everything now depended on whether his pilots could find and destroy the enemy fleet. At 11:45 a.m., Kobayashi's squadron spotted Task Force 17. They picked out the Yorktown as their main target and moved in with great skill, surprising the American defenses with better coordination in flying. Details of this attack were later recorded in both Japanese and American reports. Yorktown's guns fired intensely as the dive bombers came down. The carrier tried to dodge the bombs, and Wildcat fighters went up to stop the attackers. But the Japanese showed the same high-level flying skill that had made them so feared across the Pacific. 3 bombs hit Yorktown directly, badly damaging its engines and flight deck. The ship slowed to just 6 knots as engineers worked to keep power on and crews fought the spreading fires. Once again, the Japanese had shown they could strike back with deadly skill. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch led his fighter group in a desperate attempt to defend Yorktown. His pilots used new teamwork tactics to try to match the superior Japanese planes. Even though damaged crews were doing their best, Yorktown was still open to another attack. Admiral Fletcher moved his command to the cruiser Astoria, knowing Yorktown couldn't lead the fight anymore. The momentum was shifting back toward Japan. Yamaguchi got ready to send a second wave. 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. Determined to finish off the American carriers, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, even though his own plane was damaged, offered to lead the attack. At 12:45 p.m., American radar spotted the incoming planes, but there was very little time to prepare. Yorktown, moving slowly with a wrecked flight deck, couldn't launch more fighters. It looked like she wouldn't survive another attack. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher led 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise toward Hiryu, now the last active Japanese carrier. Based on scout reports, they believed Hiryu was northwest of the American fleet. The afternoon sun flashed off the wings as the planes climbed to bombing height, carrying America's hopes of keeping control of the Pacific. Admiral Spruance had ordered the strike as soon as Yorktown was hit, knowing Hiryu had to be stopped before she could launch more attacks. Intelligence showed the Japanese were already preparing another wave. Taking out Hiryu was now the top priority. Even as American planes approached, Hiryu continued to launch aircraft. Admiral Yamaguchi was still sure that a strong offense was Japan's best chance. His airmen got ready for their final mission. Captain Kaku watched as the last Japanese fighters took off to intercept the attackers. These Zero pilots were outnumbered and far from their home base, but they were Hiryu's last line of defense. Whether or not the carrier survived would depend on how well they could throw off the American attack. At 2 p.m., Gallagher's bombers reached perfect attack position over Hiryu. The flight deck was full of planes ready to take off, which made the carrier especially vulnerable to deadly explosions. The American pilots began their attack, aiming to wipe out the last of Japan's carrier power. The bombing run went perfectly as the planes dove in, facing little opposition from fighters. Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns fired heavily, creating defensive fire patterns, but they couldn't stop the American pilots from hitting their targets. The situation now clearly favored the attackers. Navy records and Japanese reports later showed that 4 bombs broke through Hiryu's deck and exploded among fuel-filled planes. Fires quickly spread across the hangars and upper parts of the ship, just like on the other carriers. Yamaguchi knew his last hope had failed as fire consumed his ship. With Hiryu gone, Japan had no more carriers able to attack, making any comeback impossible. The Japanese had ruled the Pacific for 6 months, and now that dominance ended in just one day. Captain Kaku ordered damage control while still trying to keep the ship on course. Even while the ship burned, Japanese sailors worked bravely to save it until the structure finally gave out. When Tomonaga's strike team came back, they found their ship in flames and couldn't land. The pilots had to either crash into the sea or find some other option. Many chose to attack American positions on Midway instead of giving up, dying in hopeless but proud gestures. From high above, American pilots saw their target burning, confirming that the last Japanese carrier had been destroyed. The balance of power had now completely swung to the Americans. Although Japanese forces still had some strength, there was no longer any chance of winning. But the final parts of the battle still had to be fought. Radio signals showed rising panic among Japanese leaders as they struggled to understand how badly they had been beaten. Yamamoto's complex plan had fallen apart completely, and his forces were now scattered with no clear orders. The trap had been sprung with crushing force. American commanders started bringing their forces together, staying alert for any surprise attacks. The battle had ended in a clear victory, but the leaders knew that a cornered enemy could still be very dangerous. On the bridge of the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood quietly, hearing the terrible news from his carrier commanders. For carriers, the core of Japan's naval air strength were now either sinking or already abandoned. American forces, once seen as weaker and demoralized, had crushed them. The man who planned the Pearl Harbor attack couldn't understand how his carefully crafted plan had gone so wrong. Radio messages painted a hopeless picture. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were all gone. Their train crews were either dead or scattered across the sea. Years of training and experience had been wiped out in one battle, destroying Japan's ability to control the Pacific. Rear Admiral Mato Mugaki reviewed reports with growing worry. The Americans had shown incredible teamwork and deadly accuracy. They had achieved more than anyone thought possible. Japanese intelligence had failed to predict this, and that failure had led directly to the disaster. Vice Admiral Nagumo's messages showed not only lost ships, but huge losses in skilled pilots. Hundreds of Japan's best flyers had died, and there was no easy way to replace them. The Navy's power had been crushed. Yamamoto now had to decide whether to keep going or pull back. His battleships and cruisers were still strong, but without planes, they couldn't finish the mission. His advisors pushed him to keep fighting, maybe even shelling Midway's base or fighting the Americans in a night battle, where Japan's gunnery skills might still give them an edge. But Yamamoto saw that without good scouting and air cover, it was useless. American carriers could strike during the day and destroy his ships. The numbers that once helped Japan now worked against it. Strategic reports after the battle, saved in Japanese records, show Yamamoto's thinking. At 12:25 a.m. on June 5th, he gave the painful order to retreat. Operation Me was over, and all Japanese forces were told to return home. It was the first time Japan's navy had pulled back from a major fight. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, one of Yamamoto's top officers, looked at what this defeat meant and saw how bad it really was. Japan had lost around 270 planes and many top pilots. The U.S. lost about 140 planes and far fewer men. The numbers clearly favored America. More importantly, Japan's ability to attack in the Pacific was now broken. The 4 lost carriers had made up more than half of Japan's total fleet carriers, and it would take years to replace them if they even could. America, on the other hand, could build more and faster. From now on, U.S. strength would keep growing while Japan's got weaker. The shift in control was final. Japan could no longer think about striking Hawaii or the U.S. coast. Now it had to defend its far-flung empire. The whole strategy of forcing America into peace talks by winning big battles had completely failed. Yamamoto understood that Midway marked the beginning of Japan's long defeat. Though the war would drag on for 3 more years, American codebreakers had turned his great plan into a deadly trap. Their intelligence edge would keep hurting Japan throughout the war. In his last log entry for June 4th, Yamamoto admitted how important the battle had been. The enemy had totally surprised them with better planning and information. Japan had walked straight into a trap, losing its best naval air power in one day. The war had now turned against them. As the sun rose on June 5, 1942, the broken pieces of Japan's fleet headed west. Behind them were 4 burning carriers and the lost dream of dominating the Pacific. The Americans had won one of the most important sea battles in history, using smart planning, bravery, and perfect execution. The trap had worked perfectly, and the Japanese hadn't seen it coming until it was too late. Midway proved that being better prepared and informed could beat even a stronger force. It set rules for naval warfare that would be remembered long after the war. The outcome of this battle would change the course of the war in the Pacific. Japan would go from being a powerful attacker to a desperate defender. Thanks to 4 hours of deadly dive bombing, American naval power was now supreme and Japan would never seriously challenge it again. The Battle of Midway was more than just a clash of ships and aircraft. It was a turning point that shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. It proved that intelligence, planning, and the courage of individual pilots could overcome even the most experienced enemy. What began as a desperate defense ended in a stunning victory, one that halted Japanese expansion and marked the beginning of a long, hard road toward Allied victory in the Pacific. Midway showed that even in the darkest moments, the tide of war can be turned by determination, sacrifice, and bold leadership.